Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today for an online public policy dialogue at the European Policy Center. My name is Andreas Aktoudianakis, and I am leading the work on digital policy at the European Policy Center. And today we're going to be focusing on the Digital Services Act and how to enhance meaningful transparency and data scrutiny for civil society. Now, obviously, there are a few things to explore under such a big and cross-cutting horizontal regulation such as the Digital Services Act, but and I'm sure that we will be able to also bring in other dimensions and considerations apart from civil society concerns as much as it involves ecosystem considerations more broadly and the enforcement of the regulation effectively. So thank you once again for joining us. This is an event that we're organizing as part of the joint project that we have been running together at the European Policy Center with AlgorithmWatch in Berlin. And this has been a 2-year-long project so far, and we've had some successes, but as things stand, we are still trying to bring more transparency and more accountability in what we see as a regulation that is going to change the digital ecosystem for at least as many years as the e-commerce directive, which dates back quite a while. Let me give you a quick overview of our project before I give some housekeeping tips, which I'm sure that you are used to after such a long time working and conferencing online. But let me first give you a couple of points about our governing platforms project and how we started. So there were mainly 3 points that brought us to this project, and mainly 3 reasons why this project was extremely necessary in this field. So first of all, a couple of years ago, we thought that the stakes are high in shaping how the digital information ecosystem for the future works. And here the Digital Services Act and Executive Vice President Vestager's work was an excellent opportunity for us to try to shape this digital information ecosystem for the future. Secondly, we have been analyzing how self-regulatory transparency works and how far it has gone over years. And there was a broad sentiment in the sector that self-regulatory transparency does not go far enough, actually does not go far enough at all. And so also together within the broader context of COVID-19, the digital society deliberates now online, and at the same time we know very little, or we still know very little about gatekeepers and what are gatekeepers, how they work, what is the algorithmic black boxes that govern the curation and moderation of online content. So because of these concerns, we worked and together also with academics in this field, the Mainzer Media Institute and the University of Amsterdam, and we have worked together on 3 studies, one looking at the challenges that algorithmic black boxes pose to online public discourse, an analysis of the needs and the different tools and strategies that can help stakeholders, regulators in regulating intermediaries, and crucially, how to operationalize intermediaries, how to operationalize data access for independent journalists and researchers. Exactly, yeah. So this is how we started, and then with the tabling of the Digital Services Act proposal in December 2020, we saw success coming in the form of Article 31 in the Digital Services Act that envisages data scrutiny, and transparency for vetted researchers and universities. Now, at this part of the project and where we're now with the proposal being tabled and debates going on as part of under the Portuguese presidency and with other stakeholders from the European Parliament and the Commission, but also within civil society, which is our tribe, so to speak. Now we want to see how this will look in practice. So how will Article 31 look in practice, but also how can the DSA be enforced and be operable and, well, essentially future-proof in that sense. So I will stop here in terms of our project, and I'm sure others such as Matthias, who's with us today too, might like to add something at the later stage. Maybe at this point, let me introduce our great panel of speakers. And just to say that we're going to have some initial inputs from our speakers of about 5 minutes. And then we're going to enter into a panel discussion up until 3:15 Brussels time. And after that, we're going to have a Q&A with the audience. So for all of you who are with us now, please keep in mind that you can send your questions even before the Q&A session starts. That will give me some time to take an idea and ask your questions at the right time. So keep them coming in, please. And so with that being said, let me start by introducing our speakers. And we have with us today Ms. Alexandra Geese, MEP, who's a shadow rapporteur on the Digital Services Act for IMCO committee and is a member of the Greens in the European Parliament. We also have with us Prabhat Agarwal, who's head of unit Digital Services and Platforms and DigiConnect at the European Commission. We also have with us Filipa Brigola, who's Deputy Attaché on Digital Policy at the Portuguese Permanent Representation to the EU. And last but not least, Matthias Spielkamp, who's co-founder and executive director of AlgorithmWatch. So with that being said, and all the rules and our speakers now announced, let me start by asking you to offer your initial inputs. And we will start with Filipa, who can offer us some perspectives from the Portuguese presidency. Then we will have Prabhat offering his own input. Then we will move on with Alexandra Geese, and then finally Matthias Spielkamp. So Filipa, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I would focus my first intervention in the work the Portuguese presidency has done on the DSA. And I would like to start by saying that at the beginning of the presidency, of course, we regarded the digital services package as one of the top priorities of the legislative agenda. So we considered it as a very important milestone to achieve the European digital strategy. So we really wanted to move forward and to deliver on this file. And so our goal, or our first goal, was to finish a first full reading of the proposal. And to that end, we had a very ambitious pace in our discussion. So the examination took place in a very intensive rhythm. There were some colleagues complaining at the beginning, but then everyone worked very hard, and especially Prabhat and his team. I would like to take this chance to thank him and to say that it was a great journey. It's not over yet. It was a great journey. I learned a lot. It was great. And because of this, and because of everyone's effort, we managed to finish the first full reading ahead of schedule. So by mid-April, it was done. We read all the 75 articles, and immediately we started drafting the progress report, because we wanted to present the progress report to the Competitiveness Council by the end of May. And About the progress report, I'd just like to say that there were some people asking us why some issues were not identified there. So what was if there was a political reason for that? And for instance, Article 31 is not identified in the progress report. But just to be clear, the progress report basically summarizes the exchanges we had at technical level, the questions and the concerns of member states, also what the issues that member states mentioned to us in our bilateral meeting. So it is supposed to be a very balanced summary of the issues that were raised. Then when we finished the progress report, we thought that maybe it would be interesting, or it would be more interesting to give the ministers not only the chance of discussing the progress reports, but also to have a more broad policy debate about both DSA and DMA. So that's what we did. We gave the ministers the chance to have a policy debate, also focusing a bit on the geopolitical aspects of the digital services package. And I have to say, well, please, personally, I was very happy with the results of the competitiveness, the policy debate in the Compet Council, because, well, first of all, it was very important to have a first political orientation. So after 6 months of the proposal being launched, and this was achieved because all the ministers shared very concrete and detailed substantial positions on the issues that we identified, and also in other issues that they regarded as very important. So it was a very meaningful policy debate. And a second important aspect about the debate was that the two incoming presidencies, so the Slovenians and the French, they affirmed their willingness to quickly move forward with the negotiation. So I think this is it was a good sign. And I would just like to give a very broad overview of the issues that ministers raised in the debate. And first of all, the geopolitical aspect. Of course, we wanted to highlight this aspect, and it was very interesting to see that there were more or less like two groups of member states, and one group really considers the digital services package as a very important element to leverage the regulatory power of the European Union. I mean, it is important. They think it is very important that the EU takes the lead and is regarded as an example. And then there was another group of member states that say that this can only be achieved. Of course, this is very important, but this can only be achieved if we were to harmonize the single market. And this would lead me to the second point, which was also mentioned by ministers, which was the level of harmonization of the DSAs, because there were some member states that are particularly worried that the level of protection given in the DSA is below their national provisions. But I think that most member states are very happy with the level of harmonization, so we will see how this will end up in the end. Then another set of questions that were raised was basically the balance between, and this is more focused on chapter 3, so the obligations regime. It was about the balance between freedom of expression and the content moderation. And this was also mentioned by Vice President Vestager, it is clear that there is a very sensitive balance between protecting freedom of expression and effectively tackling illegal content online. Now, it was also obvious that for most member states, they were not, or let's say most member states are not in favor of including harmful content in the scope, and are happy with the solutions given in the proposal. So all the solutions about the risk assessment, risk mitigation, and so on, and also on Article 31, which we will talk about later. Then another set of questions that I don't know if the Parliament is worried about this, but member states are very worried about this. It's let's say the articulation between the enforcement of the rules and the preservation of the principle of the country of origin. Because there is a large majority of member states that really want to preserve the country of origin. Of course, this is also important for the single market. And then there is a group of member states that want to give more powers to the country of destination. And we will see in the end how this will all work out. And finally, just a last point I would like to make, and we also revisited this point also at technical level after the council, is about the asymmetric approach also of chapter 3. I think that all member states are very happy with it. They support this approach, but they also think that the criteria to exclude the micro and small enterprises from certain obligations, maybe the criteria given is not enough, and maybe we should include some sort of risk-based approach, maybe a solution like taking into account the number of users, because some of these small players can, I mean, it's unlikely, but it can happen that they become very large, that they can become VLOPs. So it's something that we are still assessing. And yes, I finish for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Filipa, for offering this very useful overview. It's great to have an insight into how the debate actually took place, and all the stories behind this progress report that everybody reads but hasn't been into this meeting. So thank you so much for this. We will be able to unpack some of the things you mentioned there during our panel discussion. So for now, I'll just like to ask Prabhat to take the floor. Thank you very much, Prabhat.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you, Filipa. I normally don't like to speak before the co-legislator, I have to say, but since I didn't react quickly, I will be very brief but modest. It is now, of course, the moment when the Commission's proposal is on the table, and our role is now to assist the Council and the Parliament in their deliberations. And as Filipa has said, the Council has made great progress, and of course the European Parliament has also, based on a really very detailed, extensive preparatory work already in 2020, kickstarted the process with the publication of our first report by MEP Schaldemose in the Internal Market Committee, to which Alexandra, of course, belongs. So now I think this is a very important moment for such a big legislative initiative, where the democratic process goes on, and debates are the necessary and important debates are taking place. And hopefully maybe this panel discussion can play a small role in contributing to some of these things. The topic very much today is about transparency and enforcement of transparency, and I just want to make three basic points. First of all, we have always believed that transparency is a really central part of the Digital Services package and the Digital Services Act in particular. This has been a leitmotif, if you like, of the Commission's work when it comes to content or content moderation, be it illegal content or also in the code of practice on disinformation from the beginning. It's important actually that we articulate two axes, and this is my second point. One is, who is this transparency for? And the second axis is which platforms or which intermediaries themselves should be covered by which kind of transparency obligations. So basically in the Digital Services Act, we have kind of three addressees of transparency obligations. One is the ordinary user, you and me, who are not necessarily legal experts, although of course we may have a professional interest, but let's say family members or ordinary citizens, they have the focus of the transparency towards an ordinary user is that they need to be empowered to take the right kind of choices online, to understand the rules of the platform's moderation content rules, and to be able to exercise some of the provisions that we have introduced in the Digital Services Act on due process and rights to oppose and complain about when things go wrong. So first, transparency towards the ground rules. Second, transparency on the means to obtain redress and corrective actions, or to settle complaints. And the third one is transparency about the choices that they have, and there particularly I I want to flag some choices that we have introduced in the Digital Services Act, notably in the context of recommender systems, which I think is something that has been discussed. But then there are two other layers of transparency towards the regulator, I would say, and then finally a kind of layer of transparency which is more for specialized experts, I would say, either experts, academics who have data access obligations in the Digital Services Act, or civil society actors who can have an interest in number crunching and seeing whether there is a excess of takedowns or kind of a discriminatory behavior in takedowns. So I would call this kind of transparency towards experts, expert community, and loosely speaking. Then there's another layer which we sometimes don't talk about anymore, but it was very present in the beginning. Of course, not only transparency of platforms, but also transparency of authorities is also a very important accountability vector. So because in the Digital Services Act, of course, mainly the focus is on regulating online platforms, but we shouldn't forget that authorities also should be bound by some minimum transparency rules as well. So we have some obligations, for example, of being transparent about how many orders for takedown have been received. So that's one dimension, transparency towards whom. And then the second dimension is the graduation of these transparency obligations, depending on the size and the reach and the importance of the particular targets of the obligation. So for very large online platform, which is the regime that we have proposed in the Digital Services Act, we have a very, very extensive catalog of due diligence obligations, including very far-reaching transparency obligations. But for other intermediaries, more technical intermediaries, like content delivery networks, which were just in the news a few hours ago because of the widespread outage, there are some transparency obligations which are more limited. So this was my second point, a kind of a graduated catalog of transparency obligations, depending on who the addressee is and who this transparency should be for. And then the third point, just to answer in the debate, question about enforcement of these obligations. And of course, we have proposed a particular enforcement structure which has a new enforcer, basically creates a new enforcer on top of the rules that were already as the Digital Services Coordinator and in the country of establishment. And we have given the European Commission particular additional rules to enforce the rules. So that's about enforcement of the rules. Now, of course, we also have tried to design a kind of virtuous cycle there in the transparency obligations, which particularly tries to have build on a positive feedback loop by notably in the interaction between civil society and expert organizations who might be particularly interested in the transparency obligations addressed to them, which are kind of more aggregate, or the data ad archives and the data scrutiny obligations. And what we've seen is that this is a community that can also call out when some obligations are not working well and call for some corrective actions. And we've tried to build in a mechanism by which a virtual cycle can come through, so that the right kind of insights can be generated. That would really be my third point. Is not only about the enforcement in the sense of imposing a sanction and a penalty, is also about creating an incentive structure that incentivizes the platforms to be very cooperative. More, we've seen some good progress recently, of course, but we think that that can be enhanced even further and bring a wider range of voices into the accountability framework and the Digital Services Act. Maybe, Andreas, I just stop here and with a high-level overview of the intentions of the Commission's proposal, but of course now the DSA is firmly in the hands of the co-legislators, so our role is to listen and to support.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Prabhat. And just to be clear, I didn't mean to put you in a difficult position speaking before the co-legislator. We just had to deal with a couple of technical issues, so wanted to give some extra time to make sure that the connection will be fine. But yeah, thanks so much for your inputs. So very, very, very useful, and a couple of things there that looking forward to discuss in the discussion with everyone else. Alexandra, without further delay now, I think everything is ready. Please feel free to take the floor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you for Prabhat for going before me. I think your input is always quite illuminating and interesting, and I'm happy to be able to comment on it. So I think that puts me in an advantage. First of all, I would like to point out how much the whole conversation has shifted since I have started working on this file and in the European Parliament. I think that's very interesting, and that's also the merit of you with the Provenance Platforms project, of AlgorithmWatch, and many other actors from civil society who have pointed out that the DSA is not only about liability and about the decision whether to regulate illegal or also harmful content. I think the conversation has changed completely in the past 12 months, and I'm very grateful for that, because I think this shift acknowledges how important the DSA can really be, and that it goes far beyond just regulating how to deal with single posts or single contributions that might be illegal or might be harmful. And now we are rather looking at the systemic risks. I'm very glad to hear from Council that a majority of member states do not want to touch on harmful content as such, as single pieces of content. I think that's very good, and that gives us time for shifting the conversation to these systemic risks that are a lot more interesting in my view. So thank you very much for your contribution on that. A second point, maybe I would look at the transparency issue from a different angle than what Prabhat just outlined, which obviously makes perfect sense. I'm looking at a combination of Articles 26, 28, and 31. And for the less nerdy listeners, 26 is the article on risk assessments. Those are risk assessments that the platforms have to do themselves, the very large online platforms, especially on fundamental rights, on risks for the child. And there, I think it's interesting, because when I first looked at it, I thought, well, this doesn't really make sense, because those are platforms who are never going to explain what kind of systemic risk they are posing to society. Why should they? They're not going to harm their own business model. And from one point of view, this still makes sense. From the other point of view, I thought that if we really detail that article a little more, putting in some more risks, I realized the Commission probably limited itself to fundamental rights or to things where you have a very strong legal basis. As Parliament and as co-legislator, I think we can go beyond this. There's an issue, I'm a Green MEP, and that shows, so I think there's an issue of environmental impact that is extremely important, especially targeted advertising. There's this growing evidence that a huge amount of the electricity consumption of the great platforms of the internet is actually due to the tracking of users and not the actual service that you receive by it. I think that's something interesting. We should be looking into it. And we can't, because you can't do the research right now if you don't have access to the data. So this is something that could go in there, for example. We also need to have some more clarity on what exactly the risks might be that we want companies to look for. At the same time, and there is some kind of contradiction, I think we need some flexibility, because obviously Amazon will pose very different risks and harms, potential harms, from Twitter. Two completely different business models, two completely different ways of making revenue and of interacting with users. So I think it's a little bit difficult to tell all different platforms to do exactly the same thing. But I appreciate, I mean, the Commission probably looked at oversight in financial markets, which is sort of reflected here, and it makes sense for a start, but I think we should go deeper into it and try to differentiate a little more and to find a way for the regulator to deal with this article in a more flexible way according to the risks that that platform might pose in a certain moment. It's tricky, but I think it's doable. So this has to be seen in combination with Article 28, which is on the independent audits, which is also an article where my first thought was when the Commission wasn't able to come up with an idea of who should do these independent audits, even at commissioners level, it was like, well, you know, there's going to be a market. I think that was a little bit disappointing. So I've been trying to get my head around how this could be turned into something meaningful. And I think you have really given a very valuable contribution to the solution. And I think what we need here is not only independent auditors on the market, that is fine, but we need very qualified institutions that have to do this. So we need clear guidelines, very clear rules on who can do that, what kind of, well, we have to make sure we don't have revolving doors with the platforms, avoiding, you know, like Google setting up an auditing company and then sending some of them people and then taking them back 10 years later. I sort of simplify the debate, but you understand what I'm trying to say. I mean, this is a huge discussion in Brussels every time. So we need to make sure they're truly independent and they have a strong incentive to stay independent and to be really objective. And there we need rules. At the same time, we need oversight, and I think that oversight needs to be public. No private actor can really offer that. We need some kind of public oversight, and I think that should be at a European level, independently of what you think of the country of origin on other levels. But the oversight over the systemic risks posed by the very large online platforms should be European, and it should be a little more independent from the Commission, because every time the Commission has to take a decision, it gets very strongly influenced by the political level. So we need an independent agency, European agency with this very strong technical expertise on that could decide, for example, which audits need to be done for which platform, what the dimension of that audit should be. I mean, it depends on the platforms of what you really want to look at. As I said, Twitter is very different from Amazon and different from Snapchat or others. So I think that's an important point. And then we need some kind of system to make sure that the confidentiality and especially the data privacy and the respect of GDPR is ensured when raw data, for example, is handed over by the platforms in order to be analyzed. And there I'm referring to 31 already. This is something that independent agency could also ensure in some way. And speaking about 31, that is the access to platforms data for independent vetted researchers, which is an extremely important article. We insisted quite a lot on that. AlgorithmWatch insisted quite a lot on that. And I'm very grateful that the Commission put it in. I think it needs to be extended a little bit because vetted researchers are perfectly fine, but we do have the problem that especially a couple of large platforms are heavily contribute to the funding of a lot of universities, also public universities. So it's not that easy to find vetted researchers who are really experts in the field and who are completely independent. I think also investigative journalists and some NGOs are playing a very important role here in showing what the risk is and looking at specific aspects, because you might want to look at, I don't know, the risk for LGBTI groups posed by certain platforms, for example. So there will be different organizations or platforms having very specific expertise that you might not find among academics. So I think we need to find a solution here with clear rules. And I really liked quite a lot the idea that AlgorithmWatch and the Governing Platforms project brought forward last year on the clearance house for the data in order to make sure that the data is really protected, that GDPR is abided by, and that the data cannot be abused, because we obviously don't want that data to go into the wrong hands. I mean, there clearly is a risk that needs to be acknowledged. Maybe later Matthias wants to go more into the details of that proposal that I appreciate very much, and I will try to get into the DSA. But as I said before, we need some kind of public oversight. We can't just have a privatized oversight, to come back to 28 on the independent audits. The difference to the financial sector is that in the financial sector, on the financial markets, you have a third party who has a keen interest in making sure that the audits are objective. Speaking about shareholders, speaking about financial markets, they have this keen interest and they have the power to make sure this happens. And already those kind of independent audits are not working perfectly, as everybody who's familiar with the Wirecard scandal, for example, knows. I mean, there has been a clear failure. So it's really important we have some strong public oversight here, because normal users can play the same role in making sure that audits are objective as shareholders in the financial oversight architecture have. So really there's a third party missing that doesn't have much power here. And to come to that third party, who could be that third party? It could be civil society, because civil society is really not present in the DSA, except for all the users' rights that are extremely important. I'm very happy with that proposal of the Commission. We'll further work on it. Prabhat outlined those, the notice and action procedures, the transparency for users, that's important, but it's as single users, as individual users. I would like to see some more civil society in the oversight. Here we have a small contradiction that we don't want civil society to decide about illegal content. That's clearly a task for courts and for clear rules. So what we've been thinking is to bring in civil society in the codes of conduct, because the codes of conduct have been a very controversial instrument in the past with very controversial outcomes, where we have seen the platforms basically working with the Commission working with the platforms sort of behind closed doors, and appreciate the effort, but we're not completely satisfied with the results. And especially I'm not satisfied with this kind of procedure. And I do appreciate that the DSA, giving them a legal framework with clear rules, increasing the transparency, is addressing that concern. But I think here, this would be a good point to bring in civil society, for example, in the form of Citizens Council, which is something that nobody else is bringing up. And I think that's very interesting. We could also have Experts Council, making sure those experts are independent and a sort of counterweight to the platforms working with the Commission. So having independent experts council would be interesting to look at the results of the codes of conduct and how the codes of conduct are implemented, but also citizen councils to give policy recommendations on how to deal with some kinds of content which is not perfectly illegal, which is clearly harmful, but which we don't want platforms to handle. So I think that would be a very interesting point to work with Citizens Council, like the Irish model, where Citizens Council have given an extremely valuable contribution to handling very polarizing issues like abortion, like divorce in a very Catholic country, or in France, where they have been making excellent policy recommendations on climate change, proposing things that politicians always thought, well, we can't do that because people won't accept that. And the Citizens Council came up with great solutions. So I think this would be a very, very interesting point, the oversight over the codes of conduct, especially on hate speech and disinformation. Where you have some gray area which is not illegal, but you still don't want it because it's a societal risk. And I think they could give some policy recommendations for the future, especially on points where at this moment we really don't know exactly how to deal with it without risking to damage rights and freedoms. So as politicians, I think we have to stick to the legal framework, but I think this is a really important point to bring civil society in. And yeah, I think this is a good point for me to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. This is extremely useful and some very, very interesting points there that we would definitely like to touch upon later. Thank you. Without further delay, I'll just offer the floor now to Matthias. Matthias, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andreas, and thanks a lot, everyone, for your input already. I mean, that's a privilege of being the last one. I can just skip over lots of stuff that has already been said and go to the points that are closest to my heart, because there has been a lot that was said that I entirely agree with. So, no surprise, much of it was brought forward by Alexandra in her input. So I would like to just comment on the entirety of it. When we started this project together with the EPC, as Andreas said 2 years ago, we didn't imagine to be in the situation we are in right now, in the sense that we actually feel that we made an impact on such an important proposal that the DSA is. At the same time, we have to be very careful to not overestimate civil society's capacities at the same time. You know, we all want to be very powerful organizations, as AlgorithmWatch, as the EPC, as Access Now and EDRI and Article 19, and whoever is active in this field. We all, of course, want to be powerful enough to influence the world in the sense that it is in our mission statements, and usually, of course, we all think that we would like to be the world to be a better place. You know, it sounds a little melodramatic, but this is what we are here for. But then, when we look at something like the DSA or the DSA package, as it is now called, that is very closely tied to the DMA, that has a lot of interdependencies with the code of conduct, the code of practice, the democracy action plan, and even the AI Act that has been proposed now in the meantime, then we just have to admit that this is quite a huge piece to chew on. And we cannot really say that we have understood all these interdependencies. And I was glad that Filipa said in the beginning, you know, how much time it took them to discuss this with the Commission and Prabhat and his colleagues to get a clearer picture of this, because this is what we are still doing. And even though there are allies that we have, and even now that some funders have realized that this is something that they need to be active in, and they're trying to sort of build a field also of civil society actors and organizations there, we are far from being as powerful as we would like to be. Now, this is not about us, this is not about civil society organizations, but what we can achieve with the DSA. But it has a lot to do with that, and this is where I tie it back to Alexandra's comments, because one of the major fears that we have is that, so first of all, the positive things, like, you know, we are of course very happy that there are these provisions about data access. We are extremely unhappy that civil society organizations are not mentioned there, and we are going to fight for this to change, of course. I think we do have something going for us in the sense that we have this suggestion of how these clearinghouses could function, so that we can analyze data in a GDPR compliant way, because there's, you know, it is so clear that we have to respect people's privacy here, and that there is a risk of harming people's privacy if data, personalized data, is handed to a third party. I mean, it's bad enough that the large information intermediaries that we are focusing on already have all that data, but if it is sort of passed on even only in parts, it has to be made entirely certain that there is, first of all, privacy protection, but also safety measures and all of this in place. And this is where I also see the idea or the option to have a public institution to work as that clearinghouse, because it would be too much for I think even a public-private partnership to take this on, or not too much, but it wouldn't be a good combination. I mean, we see things like the Gaia X platform, and you know, one of the founding partners is Palantir and all this. I don't need to comment too much on this, how we find this is problematic, that the players, the companies who we would like to oversee and audit are part of the structure itself. We need to keep this separate. But if we can achieve this, then yes, I think there could be and should be access, not just to vetted academic researchers, but also to civil society organizations and maybe also journalists, which is also something that we are pushing for, because we also agree that they play a major role as part of the checks and balances in a democracy, a very, very important role, by the way. Now, coming to the risks, yes, I do see the risk that we have a system here that includes the data access and the auditing provisions, and this is, in theory, looks like a good system, but we have to still analyze of how this auditing could really take place. How does it work in practice? I've been in meetings with other civil society and academic stakeholders, and we were discussing questions like, how do you actually audit a platform like Facebook? I mean, you have to forget about the idea that you can audit Facebook, right? You can always only audit aspects of it that you find problematic and where there is also a reason why we should do this. And of course, we need to think about risk assessments and so on. And there I also have to say that this is not an easy task. I mean, we can't just keep pointing the finger at the Commission and say, yeah, you have to come up with all these wonderful provisions that then work out in practice and everything is fine. This is not how this works. We are all in this together, and we need to develop out ideas for this together. But this is actually what I would like to point out, and what is my main contribution today. Alexandra has already mentioned the financial markets, and even though there's a different incentive structure there, we see that it fails often. I mean, yes, I use the Wirecard example myself. I don't even know how prominent it is outside of Germany, but it is a major disaster in Germany. That there was this global company that basically got away for years with the fact that they just made up 1.9 billion euros on their books and no one noticed, right? This is ridiculous. And this is not happening only in that case, it's happening all the time. And now if you look at what we would like to achieve with the platforms, I think we can certainly understand what Herculean task that is that we have there before us. So the only thing I can offer today is that, yes, we are happy partly with what the DSA, what the draft has brought us, and we need to look into how to change it. And Ms. Schaldemose's report is already very encouraging with some additional auditing, algorithmic auditing provisions, and also the request to include civil society in the group of privileged stakeholders who can access the data. But we have to invest more work into these ideas of how can auditing actually be done in practice, and how we can avoid a situation that is at least similar to the financial markets, and maybe even to the data protection situation, where I would also argue that oversight mechanisms are not really working well in Europe. I'm certainly not happy with the situation there. And I can even imagine that some of the, first of all, some champagne bottles were opened in companies like EY and PricewaterhouseCoopers, who are certainly thinking that there will be an enormous market waiting for them in this auditing. But I could also imagine that some of the large platforms were not unhappy with this because they can certainly imagine a scenario where oversight is so weak that on the books everything is fine. There are all these provisions that are supposed to keep them in check, but in practice it is not applied. And this is, of course, what we need to work on to avoid in the next months, when it's still about the regulatory text itself, to make sure that we close as many loopholes as we discover. And then, of course, also afterwards, when we need to start using that in practice. So we are not going to get bored about this for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Super useful, and thank you also for responding to some of the issues that other speakers have mentioned before you, because now this gives me an excellent opportunity to continue this discussion. So yeah, thank you all for this. It was great. Considering that some of you have mentioned, you know, what's the way forward here? Because we've been in this for a while. Now we have a plan on the table, and we're discussing the plan. And you make clear what other issues you would expect to see there. But just to be clear, maybe perhaps I could ask Alexandra here. What are your key concerns regarding the progression of the file now, and how far do you think this could go in terms of the next steps for its adoption? What is the timeline in your calendar as an MEP working on the DSA?
Well, thank you for the question. My personal timeline is that I have to finalize the amendments by July 1st, and that is already a challenge because certainly with some of the things that I've been outlining before, that's sort of uncharted territory. For example, the Citizens Council and the Code of Conduct, we're trying to check with a host of different experts on how that could work. And then most of you are familiar with the fact that my main issue with the DSA is targeted advertising, and there also the devil is in the details. So that's the timeline for the shadow rapporteurs in the Committee for the Internal Market and Consumer Protection. So we will have to hand in our amendments by 1st of July. And then at the same time, more or less, I'm not familiar with all the deadlines, but more or less before summer, all the other committees that contribute to certain aspects of the DSA, like the committee, the LIBE committee, or the URI committee and the ITRE committee for industry, they have to submit their reports as well, and they have some shared competence on some aspects. And then basically before the summer break in Parliament, we will have all the different content elements that different political groups would like to see in the DSA on the table. Then the Secretariat and the Rapporteur's Office will work on setting out compromises. And then starting in September, I suppose, I don't know how much time they're going to need. I think the staff will need some vacation as well, but somewhere around mid-September would be my best guess. We will start the negotiations in order to figure out how compromises could look that would have a stable majority in Parliament. The official timeline says we will have a vote in the IMCO committee, so the Internal Market Committee, in November. I think that is quite ambitious. But I mean, if we find an agreement, I'm fine with that. That would be great. But I think it's an ambitious timeline, but we will try. That would mean we go to plenary in January, more or less. And according to the timeline of council, because we are co-legislators, obviously things will be happening in council as well. If council was ready as well in January, with their position, we would be able to enter trilogue negotiations and close the file under the French presidency in the first half of 2022. That's the optimistic version of the timeline.
Thank you very much for offering us the best case scenario. It's much missing these days during COVID planning and mitigation. Absolutely, that's very refreshing. Maybe just since you mentioned perhaps if you could give us, as far as you can, obviously, what is the sense of alignment with other committees on issues such as the ones you have mentioned. Do you think others are open or seeing the same issues, wearing the same analytical glasses, so to speak?
It depends on the committee. I think from LIBE committee, they're considering the competencies of that committee as very strong focus on the privacy, on data protection, and on users' rights. So on the notice and action procedure, for example. The first draft by the rapporteur in the LIBE committee was very good, but we will have to see. I mean, he has to find a majority for this as well, so we will have to see the final report. The committee traditionally we have a very good DSA. I think we are more in on a progressive majority. With the URI committee, we have already seen the rapporteur advocating very strongly for tackling harmful but not illegal content. And I think there we do have a conflict. Let's see how what the final URI report will look like. When he speaks in committee meetings or on the DSA, he keeps advocating very, very strongly for tackling harmful content, even if it's legal, and having it tackled by the platforms, basically. And I think there's absolutely no majority whatsoever in IMCO for that. I doubt that there's a majority in URI, but I don't know that. I don't think overall there's a majority. There's that kind of feeling that we need that in Parliament. I don't see that in the Commission. I don't see that in Parliament. And I don't see that in Council. And maybe Filipa already mentioned that, but you could come back to that. I think harmful content will not be tackled in terms of individual posts. Obviously, when we're tackling and addressing the systemic risks, we will also hopefully reduce harmful content, but that's a different thing from taking down completely illegal posts or contributions in social networks. From the ITRE committee, I honestly, I don't know. I haven't seen anything yet.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Maybe I could now turn to Filipa and touch a little bit upon some of the issues here we have mentioned. I was wondering, Filipa, maybe if possible, if it's possible to do that and do a bit of reflection on the goals of the Portuguese presidency and the progress that we have seen. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of the sense of direction on what needs to be done on the DSA from your point of view at this point, and having listened to some of the forward-looking points by Alexandra and the Parliament.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, from a negotiation point of view, of course, the Council always has to take into account what the Parliament will propose, so that we have some room to negotiate. So that there's also that aspect that we need to take into account. So I think, well, just to give you also an overview of where we're going now, our goals. So after this policy debate and everything, we had this time, so these last two months, to prepare a redrafting of the proposal, and we will present a compromise text now in June. On the 10th, we will present on our changes to chapters 1 and 3, and then on the 22nd we will present changes on chapter 2, 4, and 5. So in this way, we want to give the upcoming presidency this first compromise text. We want to have member states' reactions, and then pave the way for the upcoming presidency. And by the way, as Alexandra was mentioning, also the upcoming presidency, they said that they want to achieve a general approach by November. So I don't know if this is too ambitious or not. We will see now with how the reactions will be to our compromise text. But it's good to see that both co-legislators have the same ambition, let's say. Another important thing to say is that we are not, well, as Portuguese presidency, we are not avoiding tackling any difficult issues, but we are assuming a very balanced approach, and we try to take on board most of the member states' comments and suggestions to the text. Of course, some member states' suggestions go a bit too far, and precisely because we want to keep the negotiation power, we probably will not go as far as the member states would like. But let's see the reactions now in the upcoming weeks.
Thank you so much. And maybe a follow-up question on that, since this is super interesting. I was wondering if you like, what are the main concerns and questions from member states, especially on some of the articles that Alexandra has mentioned, and particularly on Article 31 regarding access for vetted researchers. Is there room for expanding this access as it stands?
Actually, I have to say that there were not many questions raised on that article. I think that member states were very happy with the Commission proposal. I think that the idea to give access to data, to understand how these systems work, I think it was very welcomed. Of course, we've had feedback from stakeholders who are precisely requesting, asking us to move the way that Alexander and Matthias were mentioning, so to broaden the scope of Article 31st. I think I would like to shoot to Prabhat, because he's the best to explain why. I mean, what is the logic behind Article 31st? I know that there are a lot of stakeholders, especially experts on this information, who consider that access to vetted researchers is not enough, that access should also be granted to accredited journalists, to experts on this information, and so on. Some of them also think that, for instance, the trusted flagger status should also be given to experts on this information. So yeah, I mean, there is a pressure to broaden the scope of some of these articles, but we are taking a very careful approach regarding that. But Prabhat is the best one to explain that.
Thank you, Filipa, and thank you for also indicating towards Prabhat's direction, which I'm going now. Prabhat, what would be your reactions to that, to the extent that you can react, of course? How does this? How do you think about this?
I mean, I think colleagues know me well enough that I don't pass the ball too easily. But in this particular question, actually, it's true that Matthias is probably the best place to answer this, because he's the person on the ground who will use this data and extract some, or at least his team. I maybe just have a couple of points on this. I think one thing that I just want to hold here in this conversation, which is I think very important, is that I detect anyway a very strong alignment on the objectives of what we want to achieve in the various parts of the proposal. And I think that this is really something very important to hold into. We want to hold very large online platforms to account. We agree that this accountability needs a very comprehensive framework for transparency. It also needs experts to look, independent experts to look under the bonnet, if you like. They need to look into the machine and into the machine room. And we also agree that that there is a big challenge in resource asymmetry, and resource is not only money, it's also expertise, it's also knowledge of technology, it's also manpower, it's the whole thing. So these resource asymmetries exist, and we acknowledge that they exist, and they exist in many other regulated sectors. I mean, banking sector as well, and many. I mean, there are many scandals. You know, the diesel scandal, Volkswagen diesel scandal, is another really eye opener for consumers. And despite this very comprehensive, testing framework with type approvals and all sorts of. I have to take my car to the checks, and I mean, when you look at the equipment, that they have, and the reporting obligation, and kind of systematic cheating is still happens despite a very controlled framework. I think the one root cause of this is a resource asymmetry, is that the observer doesn't have the same means as the observed, and so we can try and correct this asymmetry in the Digital Services Act, and we have this, and we have, as I outlined, several aspects. It's the regulatory structure, the Commission's powers as well. But we also have to activate civil society and all sorts of other actors around it as well. So this is the combination. But I would be very interested to hear from Matthias how it would work on the practice, because I think this is really what we are here, and we are very happy to think along this.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Prabhat. And I like how you hit the nail on the head, as they say, about the observer and observed asymmetries. These are also some sort of paradox that we've seen also in a postmodern governance, where you see that big tech companies can have a lot more information and specialization than the regulators sometimes. I'll just pass the virtual microphone to Matthias directly, following Prabhat's just comment right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Prabhat. So I take it as a given then that the change or the extension of the privilege to CSOs is then a done deal, because everyone here is already talking about it as if it were the case. And of course, I would be very happy with that. Now, can we actually then follow suit and do what people expect from us? Of course, we claim or we contend that we can make a difference. We are already running experiments from the outside without any kind of privileged access on platforms. We do what we call data donation campaigns, where we ask users to install, for example, add-ons and plugins on their computers and send data to us so we can find indications of what is going on. And actually, we always find some evidence that there is wrongdoing. It doesn't have to be purposeful wrongdoing. In some cases, I'm convinced it is, but in some cases, it's what happens with these complex systems. You know, they are errors made and there are mistakes in the code, and then we have, or you know, we talked about this a lot. There are biases, not just in data sets, but also in the models that are used. This is common. It's happening, and it has a certain outcome. Now, if someone walked up to us and said, "Hey, AlgorithmWatch, can you do that auditing thing for, let's say, YouTube?" You know, well, I would have to think about it before I put in an offer. But if you remember, there was the European Commission's fine that was levied at Google for misusing their market powers, privileging their own results in search. And it was a huge fine. If I remember correctly, it was something like 1.4 billion euros. And then, of course, there was this idea that there needs to be someone who actually controls whether this is happening, whether they are changing their practices. And the Commission put out a bid, a call for that. And the amount, the price tag they put on that was 10 million euros. So you can imagine what kind of task we are looking at. So what's my answer? What's my concrete answer? We will have to, at least that's the idea that we have right now and that we are exploring already, we will have to combine forces with academic researchers, with scientists, you know, to be able to, let's say, harness the best of all worlds here, of the people who can do top-notch data analysis, because they are in the positions to do that. I entirely agree that there is a resource asymmetry. But if you can find people who are on par with the ones who are working for the very large platforms, it's academia. And this may be the reason why it was the vetted researchers and that this framing then made it into the DSA. But I do also think that the mindset needs to be accompanied or needs to be broadened. And here is where civil society comes in. Because what we have to offer is, we certainly understand what the ideas of the public are about this, what affected communities think about this, where they have pains with what is going on. So if we can come up with a combination of the two, I think that could be something that could work out in practice to really come up with good ideas to how how to hold the platforms to account, because we are already doing so, and more opportunities would certainly also produce more approaches and hopefully better answers.
Thank you, Matthias. I'm looking at some of the suggestions that were mentioned earlier, perhaps such as how an important development would be to have something like a citizens' council, where there can be exchange of opinions and exchange of best practices, but also to get reflections from citizens on how they see the code of conduct and other platform behaviors taking place on them. I mean, I'm just a bit general here. I'm not sure I have a very clear idea in mind, but to make it a little bit more difficult for some of you, perhaps I don't know who to turn to, perhaps Prabhat, if that's okay, Prabhat. I was wondering, how could these things look in practice? What could be, the form of a citizen council, or how could these things be addressed in the proposal?
Yeah, thanks. I think, it's Alexandra who's taught most deeply about citizens' councils, to be honest. So I'm not sure I will do justice to the depth of her knowledge in this area, and I don't claim that we have thought as deeply about this issue as she has. We see different attempts around the world. I mean, the Facebook Oversight Board, or what we have proposed in the Digital Services Act, to come up with some kind of deliberative structures, either on assisting the taking of hard decisions, particularly in borderline cases, where there is no clear right and wrong. I have to say that this is not 100% the focus of the DSA, where we have really tried to emphasize very much the illegal content aspect, where there shouldn't be such a gray zone. Although, admittedly, in some areas such as defamation cases, and so we know from court cases that they're sometimes difficult to determine whether they are illegal or not, and judges take a long time. So this having this acknowledged, but I don't think that anyone is proposing that citizens' councils or such deliberative structures should replace a judge, and it's not that. I think it's more perhaps in saying that, I guess the logic is that if this is a public space, then let the public set the rules for this space, and this requires some kind of deliberative process by which the rules are set, and then rule setting is one thing, and then decision making on whether enforcing those rules is a second thing, and so and that this can have some kind of deliberative format is I think an interesting idea. We have in the DSA some elements of it, and I just want to also point out, because colleagues mentioned that wanted to strengthen the role of civil society, and so we have actually, particularly in the context of the risk assessment, is written in a recital, and it's for the experts, recital 59, where we say very much that the risk assessments and the design of the mitigation measures should be developed with the involvement of representatives of users. So they should involve users' representatives and groups of people who would be impacted by their decisions. So this is a kind of a stakeholder, and then also independent experts and civil society organizations. So it might look a bit embryonic, but it was there. I mean, it's clearly, and we wrote that deliberately with this idea in mind, that what we don't want is a situation where everything is done by the platforms and then submitted to this audit process, and no deliberative process has taken place at all. That would then back to square one, because it would be this unilateral rule setting that we just want to avoid throughout these whole processes, and then also bear in mind that some of these organizations have representative power under Article 67, so that they have they're given collective power to raise issues with the digital service coordinator. So it's not like they can be fobbed off very easily. They can associations can work together. So while I don't have a specific comment on this idea of citizens council, and as I say, I have sometimes much better place and to comment on this, I think the principle that it shouldn't be the platforms alone is in the DSA, and of course it can be formulated in different ways, or amplified or de-amplified. I mean, this is up to the process at the moment, but the idea was there.
Thank you, Prabhat. Maybe since you nodded towards Alexandra's direction, maybe I just offer Alexandra the opportunity to comment to that if she would like.
Happy to do that. I love this method that I put in the ideas and Prabhat has to operationalize. That's a really nice division of labor, but I'm afraid I have to do it myself. Yeah, the general idea, I think, is one born out of my concern for democracy, and that we see really a rise of citizens, a number of citizens who believe that they're governed by some mysterious powers. And I think the platforms and the way they work increase this feeling of being very small, having very little power to intervene in the debate, and that there are always dark patterns and strange things going on. And the problem is that when you look into how the platforms work, so that leads to a general mistrust in democracy and democratic procedures. And the problem is that it is half false, but there's some truth to it. I mean, that lobbying by the big platforms does have an influence in Brussels is an open secret. So there is some truth to that. It is true that we really know that even more than those concerned citizens, that we are being manipulated by the business model behind the platforms, not because they have any specific political intentions, but because it allows them to increase their revenue. So I think we really need to give people the feeling they can make a difference. They have an influence, they're able to understand what's going on, and they can change it and make recommendations. And the very difficult element always in deliberative democracy or more direct democracy is how do you preserve representative democracy at the same time, and how do you combine these elements? Because I'm a strong believer in representative democracy. I don't want to change that. So the idea are these citizens council that have been making very good proposals in Ireland or in France, as I mentioned before. They are basically randomly chosen citizens, but they have to be representative of the population. So in terms of gender, in terms of income brackets, in terms of ethnic background or linguistic background, and so on. There's a series of criteria. There is a proven methodology that works. There are several organizations working on this, several governments who have used this. So there is a methodology. We don't have to make it up from scratch in the DSA. And we could do that on a European level. I mean, member states could do it as well for content or for platforms that are more national, but I think the big issues are really the systemic platforms, the large online platforms, and that concerns all of Europe. But that's an interesting question, because some things would be more acceptable in some countries in other, but then we have the issue with the national competencies, and the DSA is a European legislation, so I think we need a European Citizens Council. So this Citizens Council, these Citizens Council come together and they make policy recommendations based on the input from experts. So they get very thorough input from experts in order to understand the issue. And then they have to come up with a common solution. And one idea would be to have them discuss the results of the codes of conduct if we have more transparency there, so they would have access to all the results, and try to discuss a series of things that could be those borderline cases that Prabhat mentioned. It could also be some of the voluntary measures that are in Article, 27, or in the beginning as well of the DSA, where we don't have much transparency. Some ideas come from the United States. I mean, the United States, they have this we are also in this transatlantic discussion, and they have ideas like circuit breakers. So those, I see them more as voluntary measures by the platforms. If the content goes viral, that's clearly disinformation, or it's clearly border laws could step in with a circuit breaker. But I wonder whether this is really transparent and democratic. It's still platforms taking the decision. So I think, I don't know, we might want to look into this, but I think we need some kind of instance that could then take a decision in terms of a policy recommendation, and especially create a very public debate, you know, have a wording formulation of those results and of the problems that is understandable for everybody. Because now we have a discussion on the DSA, which is basically among, I don't know, a few hundred people all over Europe who really understand what we're talking about, especially if it's not just notice and action and illegal content, but also targeted advertisement and transparency obligations and so on. I mean, how many people do really understand this? If you want to address public opinion and speak to normal people, you have to speak about hateful speech, about disinformation and how much damage it does. But then it gets very complicated to explain what the solutions could be. And I think a citizens council could be a sort of translator in order to take the public on board. Because I think the DSA is a very important first step, but it's just introducing a mechanism to deal with these platforms and to do with social networks that might be very different if the DMA works in 10 years from now, and to have this kind of ongoing, very public, very democratic monitoring that might result, you know, in a public debate and then in policy recommendations. So that's basically my idea. That could also work. We're still sort of thinking about this, not sure whether we're coming up with an amendment or not. On terms of services, because we want some more detail on terms of service, which the Commission has not gone into much because we don't want to regulate harmful content, and I perfectly understand that. But having like a Facebook oversight board that now everybody's saying it's an independent oversight board, and it's clearly not. I mean, it's chosen by Facebook. How can it be independent? I would like to counter that kind of narrative as well, because I was appalled by the press coverage on the Trump decision. And everybody was describing as an independent oversight authority, which is it absolutely is not. So that's the kind of direction we might want to go there as well. Having a citizen council, but also I think we also need some kind of experts council as well, maybe in parallel. Still working on it. And I'm very grateful for input if you have any further suggestions, because it's hard to find and how to really make it work within the framework of the DSA. But on terms of service, well, we don't want to step in as legislator because we don't want to regulate harmful content. But I think we need a public opinion on this, and a qualified public opinion, and not just a polarizing discussion saying yes, no, and not coming up with any reasonable arguments, and especially not with compromise.
Indeed, that's very interesting. We will have a look at that and let you know of our ideas, recommendations on this. But it definitely sounds as a very ambitious and very useful also instrument. Perhaps looking here, because I think we are touching on the question of enforcement, and I'm also becoming aware of time. I wouldn't like to drop this question. I was going to ask, you know, from all of you, and please let me know who would like to have a go at this. I was wondering, apart from, you know, apart from the ideas we have discussed so far, where do you see there are currently limitations in the enforcement of the Act at the national level? We're looking at the very diverse political group sometimes, and I don't mean to suggest that there are divisions, but when it comes to rule of law backsliding, we know that there are issues there, and other stakeholders have said that it's hard to give access to civil society organizations, because sometimes you might have civil society organizations coming from places in the EU where rule of law backsliding is an issue. So, you know, I mean, this is just one example. So in that case, I was wondering, you know, we're talking about a citizens council, but there's also this problem with rule of law backsliding and etc. So will digital services coordinators be able to exchange on all these issues and reach decisions in an effective way that's going to boost enforcement? Where do you see currently limitations in the enforcement of the Act, and what would those be? Please feel free to take the floor if you have the answer to that. Perhaps Filipa? Yeah.
Yes, I think Alexandra touched upon very important aspects, and when I was just considering, because that's I mean, the Citizens Council, it's an interesting idea, but it looks a lot like a parliament, right? I mean, it's representative. It also has the inputs from experts and so on. So maybe we are stepping a bit too far. I don't know. It's just, it was just me reflecting my personal ideas. And I think that we should give enough resources, so exactly to ensure that the rules will be effectively enforced. We should give enough resources to the digital services coordinators. And another very important thing is, and Alexandra also mentioned this, is that, I mean, decision makers are not aware of what we are discussing here. We are decision makers, but the majority of decision makers in the European Union, they're not aware. They don't have enough knowledge of the digital policies, the digital environment. They have no idea how to, which solutions are the best or the most effective without jeopardizing fundamental rights. So I think there are lots of layers before we move straight to citizen councils, or maybe this could be a parallel solution, but there's a lot of work to do also on human resources and broadening the awareness of the issues we just discussed here. Yes.
Thank you, Filipa. Prabhat, if I might turn to you, I think you know, from previous exchanges, we have discussed how some limitations there in enforcement at member state level. What room do you think should there be for coordinators, for them to have a forum where they can exchange on best practices, especially if it comes to issues such as harmful content, which is also culturally dependent in some cases?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that, I mean, as you know, the enforcement structure of the DSA has these three components that are all three of them are new in a way. The architecture around the digital services coordinator at the national level, which in itself can work together with other competent authorities, depending, because a horizontal instrument, we don't expect necessarily every time a single agency to be able to cover the whole spectrum of issues that arise. And then a second part of our, the enforcement structure is this board, this European Board of Digital Services Coordinators. This is exactly the kind of forum that that you mentioned. And then we have a special role for the Commission. I mean, it has basically, in a summary, it has kind of two particular roles. It supports the board, also with technical expertise, and then it has enforcement powers for very large online platforms under certain circumstances. So that's a little bit the structure. So I think that indeed, one thing that has really become very clear from our preparatory work at the European, but also from the experience at national levels, is that in many cases, different agencies need to sit together around the same table to share experience, because it's very rare that that a problem is really a single agency problem. And this is something that's very important. You know, you need law enforcement people for some categories of illegal time. We need media regulators. We need you know, people who know about data protection. And I mean, let me give you a simple example: revenge porn or you know, gender-based violence online. This intersects immediately a whole variety of different agencies. You know, it's criminal in many member states, so law enforcement authorities have a role to play. There's an underlying crime that needs to be prosecuted in most cases, investigated and prosecuted in most cases. It's in some jurisdictions, it's linked to data protection because it's a violation of personality rights and the data protection. In other cases, it's outright illegal, depending on the particular jurisdiction at hand. And so if it is a video that has then under the AVMSD rules, probably also the media authorities have a role. So it's very hard. It's just to give a single example. This is typically, I'm not saying who is the competent authority, but I'm just saying that it intersects many different areas, even in a single country. Now, if such a problem has a European dimension because it is shared on a particular platform, which is hosted in another member state, then immediately you have a cross-border situation, and it's also likely that the victims of this are not limited to one country. This is maybe something that is also a European phenomenon. But just to give you an illustration of something where immediately you need to bring different people, different bodies together and I guess, and this is something that I often say, then tackling the problem on the platform is one thing, but tackling the problem in society is an altogether different thing. And let's not forget that that ultimately, I mean, we should also tackle the problem in society. And even though here we are focusing on the regulation of platforms, but there needs to be some kind of link to things that go on. And this is also why, for example, in the area of disinformation, the Commission has also committed itself to media literacy areas. I mean, I know this is another, I'm jumping from two different things, but just to say that, therefore, I do think that these cooperation structures are extremely important. They need to be formalized and they need to be impactful, and they need to become very important forums to discuss also these edge cases. My only hope is, and this is also what is written into the DSA, is that these are not closed conversations behind closed doors, because they need to involve experts, but they also need to be known to the wider public. They need to involve they need to have the necessary legitimacy, also maybe the parliamentary oversight that is necessary for such decisions to take place. So that's my only concern. But I do agree with you, Andreas, that such structures are very, very important.
Thank you, Prabhat. That's super interesting. I'm aware that we're running here over time. I'm sorry. There's just so much room to cover. Just one more question to Alexandra before I then pass over the floor to Matthias again. Alexandra, I just wanted to touch a little bit on one you mentioned earlier on targeted advertising. You mentioned that, and this is super interesting, how CO2 emissions are quite increased from platform operations that are doing targeted advertising. And I think this is also very interesting, considering, this broader debate. We're talking about citizens' concerns when it talks about, disinformation, this and that. These are extremely interesting what we've been discussing so far, but we haven't touched a little bit on the green aspect. And we've been talking at EU level for a long time now about the twin transition, about how to pair green and digital. And it seems like this is a very interesting entry point, because citizens are also very concerned about the progress we do as Europeans on tackling environmental concerns here. So how much room is there to tie arguments about greater transparency on this twin aspect, not just the how to protect public debates online, but also how this can also have a positive impact for the environment?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for picking that aspect up. That I'm a little bit surprised about how the Commission is very clearly focusing on this mandate on the Green Deal on the one hand, and on the digital regulation on the other hand, which is, a very good thing to do. But I still fail to see a little bit of strong connection between the two, when it is clear that if we don't handle the environmental impact of digitalization well, it might really, reduce strongly the impact of all the measures we are taking within the Green Deal. So this is, I think, very important to have this connection. And then something that I found out recently, and I wasn't aware of until like a few months ago, is really how much energy and resources are consumed just by the tracking of users in the internet. So not by providing the actual service that, as we are seeing right now, is extremely useful and can have a very positive impact on society and also advance green goals, but really on tracking people, on behavior probably not compliant with GDPR, and that has the only positive of increasing the revenues of very large online platforms. So I think we have to create transparency on this, because within the Green Deal and change so many things in European industry and the way we live together. Our cities will change, our industry, our companies are making huge efforts, really huge efforts to adapt to the need of combating climate change. And I don't see why those companies that are making most money globally with less staff, with very, very few staff in proportion to the kind of revenue they have, should be completely exonerated from at least being transparent about it. So there are a few studies. We don't quite know how reliable these studies are because, as we all know, the researchers don't have access to the data. So I think the DSA could be a place where to force them to give access to that data and to include the environmental aspects in their risk assessment. I think that's extremely important. And I think this is shared, something I wanted to mention before, and I'm really in a lot of transatlantic conversations with different people, colleagues from Congress, Stanford University, and so on. And there's a lot of thinking about this as well. And I really need to take this chance of the Biden administration coming in with so much progress on tax, for example, a great openness on data privacy. And there are some interesting developments there as well. And I was a few weeks ago, it was unfortunate, it was under Chatham rules, so I can't say who said it, but it was someone from who you wouldn't expect it, that he said, well, half of the environmental impact of the internet is due to the monetization and not to the actual services. I don't know if that is correct. I will check, we will follow up on this. But I think that's sensational if that is true. So this is also an aspect we should make transparent and we really should tackle from not only from a privacy point of view and a business model point of view, but from a Green Deal point of view. That's absolutely in line with the objectives of the European Union right now.
Thank you. This is fascinating. And yeah, that would be extremely interesting to see more research coming out of this. And this is also a topic that we feel that has not been explored enough when it comes to the twin transition and how to sort of bridge and link all these different digital developments with the Green Deal objectives. Maybe here I can also point to the chat of this panel, because Matthias has just offered some interesting research that AlgorithmWatch has done on this, and I'll take this opportunity to pass to give the floor to Matthias if he would like to respond to some of the different themes, topics we have discussed so far. It might also be a nice way to commit a full circle in this discussion. Matthias, over to you.
I'm not going to try to sum this up. No, I mean, we're already running over, so I'll be really brief. Yes, I think that the sustainability aspects of the use of artificial intelligence, not how can we use artificial intelligence to reach sustainability goals, sustainable development goals, but also what are the sustainability aspects of artificial intelligence use in itself, is something that needs a lot more research. We are engaging in that research, and there's a community growing that does that. There's also a workshop coming in mid-June by the University of, organized by the University of Bonn, Amy van Winsberge, who's doing a workshop on this issue. And I do think that there needs to be a lot more work done on that. And then just one quick remark to the discussion that you had before about the contextual situation when it comes to content regulation. I mean, this is exactly why we are focusing on the transparency and the auditing issues, because we respect that there are different ideas about this in different countries. And it's also why there is such a high risk in going to the content directly, in the sense that let's define what harmful content is and then combat it. And I'm really happy to have heard today that no one here in this room is of the opinion that we should attempt to do this. This is really, really important. We should focus on other things, and whether there's amplification and stuff like that. But that's a very, very fine line. That's a very important line to draw. And I'll close with that, because I mean, there would be tons to say, but I think we need to wrap up.
Thank you very much for your time, all. This was great, fascinating, and thank you all for taking the time to speak here today. Your inputs are extremely useful for us and our audience, and also for continuing these discussions with a view to having them going past the post in the best possible way. I won't take any more of your time. We've already been quite running over time for some time. So I'll just take this opportunity to thank everybody and say goodbye, and have a good rest of the day. And let's definitely stay in touch on all of these and see how they progress. Thank you so much.